Today's story takes us to the rugged mountains of Idaho, where one man thought he'd finally found peace, until a group showed up claiming his land was theirs. What followed was a battle fought not just with words, but with grit, determination, and the unshakable will to stand his ground. Let's dive in. I used a gun to drive HOA officers from my property. They sued me, and lost. I'm writing this with the hope that my experience might help someone else out there. Someone feeling trapped by the constant hustle, the endless city lights that never go off, the grinding routine that never seems to let up. If that's you, maybe my story will give you a little piece of insight or at least a good read. Let me start by explaining why I decided to leave everything behind. For a solid 2 decades, I worked as a marine engineer. It sounds a bit glamorous on paper. Traveling to ports around the world, inspecting ships, overseeing repairs, managing the complexities of maritime regulations. The truth, though, is that the job was all-consuming. I was never home, constantly living out of a suitcase or cramped ship cabins, surrounded by the thrumming of engines and the salty air that made my hair coarse and my skin perpetually dry. When I wasn't at sea or in some random port halfway around the globe, I was stuck in meeting after meeting, tangled in bureaucratic red tape. The companies I worked for changed policy seemingly every week. New forms, new procedures, new ways to complicate what used to be straightforward tasks. Office politics soared to ridiculous heights. One colleague would undercut another to climb the corporate ladder, while emails flew around with veiled threats and backhanded compliments. Exhausting doesn't even begin to cover it. Eventually, I woke up one morning in a port city. Could have been anywhere. Really, they all blur together after a while, and stared at myself in the mirror of a dingy hotel bathroom. My reflection looked hollow. Dark circles under my eyes, a constant tightness in my chest, and a dryness in my throat that I couldn't seem to shake. Something inside me had shifted, like a steel cable snapping under too much strain. I realized I was tired. Tired of the noise, tired of the pointless meetings, tired of the unrelenting push to do more, be more, earn more. I made a decision then. It was time for a new life. Time for something drastically different. I wanted to experience true freedom, the kind that comes when you can hear your own thoughts without the roar of traffic or the incessant ping of incoming emails. And so, after fulfilling my remaining contract obligations, I resigned. I walked away from that entire life. My career, my circle of colleagues, even the city I'd grudgingly called home. My friends thought I'd lost it. My extended family said I was making a rash decision I'd regret in a couple of years. But deep down, I knew I needed a blank slate. That blank slate appeared in the form of a listing for 20 acres of untouched wilderness in Idaho. When I first saw the photos, I felt a tug in my gut, like an internal compass pointing me toward someplace I belonged. I remember the aerial shots of towering pine trees, an endless canopy of green, with a rocky ridge line in the distance. A sliver of a dirt road cut through one corner of the property, but other than that, it was pure wilderness. No structures, no power lines, not even a well. Just raw land. Buying that land was no simple feat. I poured my savings into it and spent hours on calls with a real estate agent, verifying every boundary, every survey. I went through all the official channels at the county office to confirm that the property wasn't subject to any hidden encumbrances, especially not an HOA. My biggest fear was finding out, after signing on the dotted line, that the area had some homeowners association lurking in the background. I'd seen enough nightmares from my friends who lived in suburban communities. Too many rules, too many fees, too many petty battles over mailbox colors or the height of a fence. But the real estate agent assured me this place was free and clear. No covenants, no extra rules, no outside entity meddling in my business. I paid for my own lawyer to go over it too. The lawyer even combed through official county maps and boundary records, verifying that there was no existing or pending HOA that could claim authority. When he was done, he handed me a stack of documents and said, "It's yours, Liam. Congratulations on the freedom." Stepping onto that land for the first time was surreal. I drove for hours to reach it, passing small towns, farmland, winding roads that got narrower the deeper I went into Idaho's mountainous region. Eventually, the paved road ended, turning into a gravel one that seemed to stretch on for eternity. After another mile or so, even that gravel disappeared into a dirt path, flanked by tall evergreens. I remember the sense of awe I felt at the sheer silence. No traffic, no city hum, not even the typical neighborhood sounds of barking dogs or lawnmowers. There was just the wind through the pines and the distant call of a bird. It took months of living in a modest RV on the property before the cabin stood tall. By cabin, I mean a real log cabin, built with my own hands, though I did hire a local crew to help with the heavy lifting for the walls and the roof beams. The structure had 2 bedrooms, with thick log walls treated to withstand the elements. I included a broad front porch, imagining myself sipping coffee in a rocking chair on crisp Idaho mornings. Inside, a stone fireplace anchored the living room, and I made sure to install massive windows facing the valley below. Every morning, the sunrise would blaze across the sky, painting the valley in shades of gold and pink. And in the evening, the sunset would reflect off the mountains, turning them a soft purple. That cabin wasn't just shelter. It was a statement, the physical embodiment of the freedom I'd longed for. Every log I sanded, every stone I laid in the fireplace, every nail I hammered into the beams reminded me of what I'd left behind and what I'd gained in return. No more neighbors telling me to move my car. No more HOA restrictions on what color my house could be or how tall my grass was allowed to grow. It was a home built on my terms, in a place where I could finally hear my own heartbeat instead of the rattle of the daily grind. At the time, I was convinced that no one could ever strip me of this freedom. I'd done my due diligence, hired professionals, and double-checked official county documents. If anyone tried to say otherwise, I was ready to wave my paperwork in their face and show them the door. Little did I know just how thoroughly some people can ignore the truth, and how their arrogance and greed could threaten everything I'd worked for. Right then, though, in those early days of settling in, I felt invincible. My mornings were spent chopping wood, brewing strong coffee over a wood-burning stove, and taking long walks through the trees. Some days I'd hike down to the stream that ran about a mile from my cabin, just to fill my canteen with crisp, cold water straight from nature's tap. I even started messing around with a small vegetable garden, though the rocky soil and the altitude made it tricky. The nights were unbelievably quiet. I'd sit out on the porch, watch the stars, and let the hush of the forest fill me with a peace I'd never known in the city. If you'd asked me then what could possibly go wrong, I'd have shrugged. As far as I knew, I was the only person for miles around with a legitimate claim to that slice of Idaho heaven. The nearest neighbor was about 5 miles away, an older couple who kept to themselves. I'd occasionally pass them in town when picking up supplies, and we'd exchange small talk. They never mentioned any homeowners association. They just seemed happy to know someone else was enjoying life off the beaten path. I couldn't have been more content. No monthly fees, no petty fines for leaving my trash can on the curb too long. Just me and the land, living life on my own terms. I truly believed that was all there was to it, that once you've done your due diligence, once you've staked your claim and paid your dues, nobody could come along and say otherwise. As it turns out, there are people in this world who thrive on intimidation and fraud, who see remote properties and independent homeowners as opportunities for exploitation. But for that fleeting period, ignorance was bliss. I woke up each day to the smell of pine, feeling like I'd finally taken ownership of my life. Every time the wind rustled through the trees, it felt like nature was whispering a welcome message. You belong here. That sense of belonging was the best thing I'd experienced in years. I wish the story could have ended right there. Me living the dream in the mountains, off the grid, forging a quiet, self-reliant existence. But reality had other plans, and it all began with the arrival of 2 black SUVs on a morning so crisp and clear that I still remember every detail like it's etched in my memory. I should have known something was off the moment I saw the dust cloud rising in the distance. My driveway, a winding, unpaved road that cut through dense forest, usually never saw traffic unless it was a delivery I'd specifically arranged. The rest of the time, the only vehicles that might venture that far were the occasional lost tourist or a county truck checking on the remote roads. But on this particular morning, I spotted not one but 2 sleek, black SUVs rolling in tandem, each one kicking up a trail of dust behind them. Initially, I was more puzzled than alarmed. I set down my coffee mug on the porch railing and stood up, squinting at the approaching vehicles. They weren't the kind of trucks I'd see from local hunters, and they certainly didn't look like any county maintenance or police vehicles. They were the glossy, expensive kind you'd expect to see in a wealthy suburban neighborhood, not creeping down a barely there road in the Idaho backcountry. As they came to a stop in my yard, what passes for a yard, anyway, I felt a knot form in my stomach. The driver's door of the first SUV opened, and out stepped a woman, mid-40s, maybe early 50s, clad in a tailored black blazer and high-heeled shoes that looked completely out of place in the wilderness. Her hair was neatly tied back, and she had that kind of posture that screams, "I'm in charge, and I know it." Behind her, the second SUV emptied out two men, each wearing crisp polo shirts and slacks. They had clipboards in their hands, like they'd come prepared for some official inspection. The woman was the first to speak. "Good morning," she said, her tone formal but laced with an undercurrent of condescension. "I'm Sarah. I represent the local homeowners association." She gestured at the men behind her as though they were her personal entourage. "We're here to discuss the outstanding balance and the new regulations affecting your property." My immediate reaction was confusion, followed by annoyance. "Homeowners association?" I repeated, letting my disbelief show. "There's no HOA out here. This land doesn't fall under any community covenants or restrictions." Sarah gave a thin-lipped smile, the type that doesn't reach the eyes. "Actually, our HOA recently expanded its boundaries to include this region. We've documented everything in these papers." She snapped her fingers, and one of the men approached, holding out a folder thick with documents. "You've accrued a series of fines and dues," she continued, "as well as fees for non-compliance with structural guidelines. We've tried to contact you multiple times, but it seems we never received a response." I stared at the folder for a moment, debating whether to take it. "I never got any notice because there is no HOA here," I said, each word dripping with frustration. "I purchased this property specifically because it was free of all that nonsense. I verified it with the county before I bought. And I sure as hell am not paying any dues to an organization that popped up out of nowhere." Sarah's brow furrowed, but her forced smile remained. "You can contact the board to dispute the charges if you feel they're in error," she said, in a tone that implied she was merely placating me. Then she added, "However, we do expect compliance. It's best if you settle your obligations as soon as possible to avoid further penalties." My gut told me something was really off. This wasn't just some routine or a misunderstanding. I decided to be firm. "Look," I said, crossing my arms over my chest, "you need to leave. I don't acknowledge your HOA, and I'm not interested in anything you're selling." I glanced at the men behind her. "This is private property. If you don't turn around and drive away, I'm calling the sheriff." Sarah didn't budge an inch. Instead, she gave me a pitying look. "We can sort this out amicably," she said, flicking a stray pine needle off her pristine blazer. "But if you insist on being difficult, we're prepared to move forward with legal remedies. Your refusal to pay doesn't nullify your obligations under the association's governing documents." That did it. I felt my temper flare, but I kept my voice controlled. "Lady, I don't care what fake documents you have in that folder. My property isn't under your control. You step onto my land again without an invitation, I'll consider it trespassing." Her eyes narrowed. "You'll regret that attitude," she said, her voice hushed yet dripping with menace. And with that, she motioned to the men to follow her back to the SUVs. They drove off, leaving me standing there with my coffee going cold on the porch railing. Once they were gone, I glanced at the folder they'd left behind on the ground. It was stuffed with dozens of pages. Forms, notices, a breakdown of alleged dues, late fees, and even a schedule of fines for unauthorized structures and landscaping. My name was typed neatly on the first page with an invoice demanding $32,000 in back dues, plus more if I didn't pay by the end of the month. The absurdity of it made me laugh out loud. A hollow, incredulous laugh, but a laugh nonetheless. They might as well have told me I owed them for the oxygen I was breathing. Part of me almost brushed it off as a bizarre scam. Some con artists dreaming up an HOA scheme to get easy money from unsuspecting landowners. But another part of me, the more cautious part, sensed this was more serious. They had official-looking documents referencing specific zoning regulations, county codes, and they even had some pages stamped. I had no idea if those stamps were legitimate or forged, but it was unnerving to see them. I called the county office to double-check if there was any record of new HOAs. The clerk on the phone sounded puzzled, confirming that my property was still listed as free of any association. I felt a wave of relief, but also a spark of anger. If the county records still had me marked as outside any HOA, what the heck was Sarah doing on my property claiming otherwise? It didn't make sense. Over the next day or two, I tried to put the incident out of my mind. I had errands to run, like restocking firewood, maintaining the generator, and making a trip into town for groceries. In a remote place like mine, simple chores can eat up an entire day. I shoved Sarah's folder into a drawer in my cabin and told myself it was probably just some elaborate scam that would blow over. But something gnawed at me. Whether it was the way Sarah spoke with such conviction or the mention of legal remedies, I couldn't quite shake off the encounter. Late at night, as I sat by my fireplace, the logs crackling and sending flickers of light dancing across the wooden walls, I found myself replaying the scene in my head. Her sharp suit, the men with clipboards, the folder stuffed with documents. If it was all a scam, it was an awfully coordinated one. In hindsight, I wish I'd taken immediate steps, like driving into the county office in person and demanding they investigate. Maybe I could have nipped the whole thing in the bud. But at the time, I was still riding the high of my newfound independence. I'd gotten used to the idea that out here in the boonies, no one could really bother me with the usual city or suburban nonsense. I guess I underestimated just how determined some people can be when there's money or power to be had. I went to bed that night thinking that maybe, just maybe, I'd seen the last of them. The next morning, I'd chop wood, listen to the wind in the pines, and continue my quiet life in the mountains, untroubled by outside forces. Little did I know that was only the opening salvo of a battle that would soon threaten everything I'd built. The first clue that this wasn't just a harmless scam came in the form of small but maddening incidents. First, it was the mail. I used to pick up my mail from a small post office box in town or have it delivered to a locked mailbox at the end of my driveway. Suddenly, nothing arrived, no bills, no postcards, no packages. Initially, I chalked it up to the occasional hiccup that remote areas experience. But after a week of no deliveries whatsoever, I called the local post office. They told me something bizarre. My address no longer existed in their system. The clerk on the phone insisted that I must have filed a change of address or that the property's address was never registered properly. I explained that I'd been receiving mail there just fine for months, but the clerk said, "I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. You'll need to update your address details with the county." That same week, I woke up one morning to find 2 of my truck tires slashed. Not a slow leak or a stray nail, but deliberate punctures in the sidewalls. At first, I suspected it might be some teenagers pulling a prank, maybe venturing from a nearby town. But teenagers seldom drive all the way to a remote property for such random vandalism. There were plenty of easier targets closer to civilization. Plus, the cuts looked precise, not random. Each tire had been stabbed in nearly the same spot. Then there was the county inspector who showed up unannounced. I was out back, splitting logs, when I heard a vehicle rumble up to the front. This time it was a county truck, so I at least recognized the emblem. A middle-aged man stepped out, wearing a county-issued jacket and holding a clipboard. He told me someone had reported an illegal structure on my property and that he needed to inspect. I nearly laughed because the only structure I had was my cabin, built with permits in full compliance with county regulations. Everything had been signed off before I moved in. I showed him the permit details, and after a quick look around, he agreed that everything was in order. But the fact that someone had taken the time to file a false complaint sent my mind spinning with possibilities. Who would bother doing that? Of course, I knew the answer, but part of me was still hoping it was just a coincidence, or maybe a neighbor with a grudge I didn't know about. Denial can be strong, especially when you're clinging to the idea that you've escaped all the nonsense of the outside world. However, Any illusions I had left were shattered one morning when I found a dead raccoon nailed to my front door. I can't describe the shock and disgust that washed over me in that moment. The animal had been killed recently, and whoever did it arranged the blood in the shape of an X across my door. The sight turned my stomach, but more than that, it terrified me. This wasn't a random act of animal cruelty. This was a message deliberately placed to instill fear. I called the local sheriff's office right away. The deputy who showed up seemed just as disturbed as I was by the scene, but there wasn't much they could do without any leads. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. Just a grotesque display that was clearly meant to intimidate me. The deputy took some photos for the report and advised me to keep an eye out for anything suspicious. He promised to drive by every so often, but given the remote location, I couldn't expect a quick response if something serious happened. Budget cuts and manpower shortages were the reality of rural law enforcement. That same night, I heard gunshots, not the occasional hunting rifle echoing from miles away, but closer, multiple shots fired in quick succession near the edge of my property. I jumped up from my couch, heart pounding. Were they shooting at my house? I killed the lights and grabbed my shotgun, peering through the windows. I didn't see any muzzle flashes or vehicles, but the shots continued for a few seconds, then went silent. The adrenaline rush had me shaking, wondering if I was about to be attacked. I stayed up the entire night, lights off, gun in hand, ears straining for the crunch of footsteps on gravel or the snap of twigs near my porch. But nothing else happened. When morning came, I did a thorough inspection of the property, walking the perimeter with my shotgun resting on my shoulder. I found no shell casings or damage to the cabin. It was as if they just fired into the air or into the woods, close enough for me to hear but far enough to remain hidden. That was the tipping point for me. Someone wanted me scared, on edge, uncertain of my next move. And it was working. I could feel the tension coiling inside me like a spring. Sleeping became difficult, and every rustle in the woods made me jump. The question why kept looping in my mind. Why are these people so determined to push me off this land or make me comply with their phony HOA? It had to be about power or money, maybe both. I wondered how many other landowners in the area might have experienced the same harassment. My nearest neighbors were a few miles away, and I hadn't heard of anything like this happening to them, but we weren't exactly on a texting basis. I decided to try reaching out. I knocked on a few doors, left messages with folks I knew slightly, asking if they'd encountered any similar incidents. Most people looked at me with sympathy but said they had no idea what I was talking about. A few joked that maybe I'd upset a local ghost or spirit in the woods. While well-intentioned, the jokes just reminded me how alone I really was in this. As days passed, the harassment continued. Some nights I'd hear the distant rumble of an engine on my driveway, but by the time I made it outside with a flashlight, no one was there. Another time, I found an envelope tacked to my porch railing. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the message, "It's just business," scrawled in black marker. No signature, no official letterhead, just those 3 words that felt like a twisted threat. Gradually, fear gave way to anger. These people wanted me to feel powerless, but I refused to let them win. If they thought they could bully me off my own land, they had another thing coming. I spent years working on massive cargo ships under hostile conditions, dealt with storms, mechanical failures, and sometimes questionable clients. I wasn't some helpless victim. If they wanted me gone, they'd have to drag me out kicking and screaming. I called the sheriff's office again to update them, but the answer was the same. Unless I had concrete evidence or a direct threat from a known individual, there wasn't much they could do. I couldn't blame them entirely. They had limited resources, and most of the incidents I reported lacked actionable leads. The deputy suggested installing security cameras, motion sensors, anything that could help me gather proof of trespassing or vandalism. That gave me an idea. If I was going to win this fight, I needed evidence. It was time to stop playing defense. I decided to fortify my property not just for my own peace of mind, but also so I could catch these people in the act. Little did I know how quickly my plan would be tested, and how close I'd come to a real confrontation that could have ended much worse than it did. I learned a long time ago that if you want to make a stand, you have to do it on solid ground, both literally and figuratively. My property, with its thick woods and rocky slopes, offered a certain natural defense, but I realized I needed to bolster it with modern security measures if I had any hope of catching these intruders red-handed. The first thing I did was invest in a set of trail cameras. These were the motion-activated kind often used by hunters to track wildlife. I placed them in strategic locations around the perimeter of my land, some near the entrance to my driveway, others facing less obvious routes where someone might sneak through the trees. I also made sure to hide them well, camouflaging them against tree trunks, covering them with bark or foliage. Anyone wanting to avoid detection would have to know exactly where to look. Next, I installed several motion-activated floodlights around the cabin. I wasn't trying to turn my place into a fortress with glaring lights that destroyed the night sky. I only put them in areas where an intruder might approach the building. Each light was rigged to a sensor, so if anyone tried to get close, they'd be illuminated like a stage performer in a spotlight. Plus, most trespassers prefer darkness. Having bright beams suddenly reveal their presence could be enough to scare them off or at least make them hesitate. I also decided on a more low-tech approach for certain perimeter points, tripwires connected to small, non-lethal flare traps. These were basically alarm flares, the kind that emit a bright light and a piercing whistle when triggered. I carefully placed them along less visible pathways, areas where I might not have direct camera coverage but suspected someone could sneak through. If a trespasser tripped one, it would not only alert me but also potentially record them on the cameras as they reacted. The final piece of my security plan was a bit more personal. I made sure to keep my shotgun loaded and within easy reach. Now, I'm not one to solve every problem with a gun, but out here, law enforcement response times can be quite long. If these intruders had already slashed my tires and left a dead animal on my door, there was no telling how far they'd go. I wasn't looking to start a firefight, but I wasn't about to be defenseless either. The transformation of my peaceful retreat into a more fortified homestead weighed on me. I'd come to Idaho to escape the feeling of constantly looking over my shoulder. Yet here I was, rigging up cameras and tripwires like I was preparing for a siege. It felt contradictory to the freedom I'd sought, but I reminded myself that true freedom only exists if you can defend it when someone tries to take it away. It didn't take long for my new security measures to be tested. One moonless night, around midnight, I was dozing in my armchair in front of the dying embers of the fireplace when the motion sensor by my front gate triggered the cabin's alarm chime. It wasn't deafening, but it was loud enough to jolt me awake. Heart pounding, I reached for my shotgun and checked the monitors I'd set up, a couple of cheap screens displaying the feeds from the trail cameras. There, in grainy night vision, I saw two figures creeping along the tree line near my fence. My fence wasn't a massive barrier, just a simple wooden enclosure marking the boundary. But it was enough to guide intruders toward the gate or make them circle around to find a weak spot. These two were clearly searching for that weak spot. They moved in tandem, scanning the surroundings with flashlights fitted with red filters to minimize visibility. Despite the tension, I felt a surge of resolve. This was exactly what I'd prepared for. I switched off the interior lights, slipped on my boots, and quietly moved to the front door. I could hear the faint crunch of gravel under their feet as they got closer. Stepping outside, I kept my shotgun pointed at the ground but ready. My heart thudded so loudly in my chest that I wondered if they could hear it. I took a deep breath and decided to make my presence known. With a loud, metallic click, I pumped the shotgun, sending a clear auditory message. The intruders froze. Through the darkness, I could barely make out their silhouettes. One of them hissed something, probably a warning to the other. They clearly hadn't expected a direct confrontation. For a brief moment, I held my breath, waiting to see what they would do. If they moved closer, I was prepared to shine my flashlight on them and order them to the ground. If they fired a weapon, I'd be forced to defend myself. Luckily, they turned and ran, stumbling over each other as they darted back into the woods. I watched them vanish into the treeline, my adrenaline roaring in my veins. I didn't chase them. Chasing a possibly armed intruder in the pitch-black forest is a recipe for disaster. Instead, I waited a few minutes to ensure they were gone, then cautiously approached the area where they'd been standing. I found a partial footprint in the soft dirt, a fresh gum wrapper, and nothing else. But the cameras had done their job. I had footage of them, albeit in night vision and partially obscured by tree branches. The next morning, I copied the footage onto a flash drive and took it to the sheriff's office. The deputy recognized one of the silhouettes as someone who'd been a person of interest in a string of property disputes, but he couldn't be sure. The individual had never been formally charged. Still, I felt a grim satisfaction in handing over tangible evidence that these people were trespassing. Maybe the law could finally step in and help. When I returned home, exhaustion hit me. Despite the adrenaline and relief, the reality was that this was just one incident. The question now was, would these intruders take this warning to heart and back off, or would they escalate their efforts? Turns out the latter was more likely. In the following days, I remained on high alert, checking cameras obsessively, keeping the shotgun close, and maintaining regular contact with the sheriff's office. I was determined to hold my ground. If the so-called HOA wanted to up the ante, I was more than willing to meet them head-on. But even I wasn't prepared for what came next. A brazen daytime confrontation that would make it crystal clear just how far these people were willing to go, and how desperate they were to claim ownership over land that had been legally, indisputably mine. A few days after I chased off those two nighttime trespassers, I was stacking firewood under the overhang at the side of the cabin. It was a typical crisp Idaho morning, the kind that makes you thankful for a working fireplace. The air felt charged, though, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Maybe it was just my nerves, still frayed from the previous incidents. I heard the roar of engines before I saw them. Two familiar black SUVs kicking up a massive cloud of dust as they rumbled down my driveway. My stomach clenched. Part of me wanted to run inside, grab my shotgun, and greet them barrel first. But I forced myself to think rationally. If they were brazen enough to show up again in broad daylight, they probably wanted some form of confrontation. I decided I'd give them exactly what they were asking for, but on my terms. I walked around to the front porch, noticing that this time there were more people inside the vehicles. The first SUV stopped, and out stepped Sarah, looking just as polished as ever. But this time, she wasn't alone. She was flanked by 5 men, each one bigger than the last. They looked like they'd stepped off a private security detail. Muscular builds, stern expressions, and a certain swagger that made it clear they were armed. Even though none of them flaunted a weapon, I could see the telltale bulge under their jackets or behind their belts. Sarah spoke first, voice dripping with cold confidence. "We gave you an opportunity to handle this amicably," she said, smoothing her blazer as though brushing off imaginary lint. "You've chosen not to respond to our notices or pay the outstanding dues. Therefore, we're here to exercise our rights." Despite the tension, I managed to keep my composure. "The only right you have here is to turn your vehicles around and leave," I said, resting my shotgun against my shoulder in what I hoped looked like a relaxed, but very deliberate posture. "I don't know what you think you can claim, but I've got a stack of legal documents that prove this land is mine. If you want to test that, feel free to head down to the county courthouse. But you're trespassing right now." One of the men stepped forward, his posture aggressive. Sarah raised a hand to stop him, then turned her gaze back to me. "You're making this harder than it has to be," she said, adopting a tone that sounded almost sympathetic, but I could see through it. "We have new governance that clearly includes your property within our community boundaries. The time for negotiation is quickly running out." "Let me make myself crystal clear," I replied. "I am not part of any HOA. I've lived here for months without a single notice, and all of a sudden, you show up demanding thousands of dollars and threatening me? You might think you can bully me, but I'm not leaving. You step any closer, and I'll consider you a threat to my life." To punctuate my words, I slid my hand lower on the shotgun, making sure they all noticed. The tension ratcheted up several notches. One of Sarah's men exchanged a glance with another, and I spotted the subtle shift in their posture, a readiness to draw if things escalated. My heart pounded, but I kept my face stoic. Sarah took a measured step forward, seemingly unafraid. "There's no need for violence," she said, her voice a practiced calm. "We're simply enforcing the association's rules. If you continue to ignore us, We will be forced to take legal action that could result in the forfeiture of your property. I couldn't help the scoff that escaped me. I'd love to see you try that. Show me these so-called legal documents. I've had my lawyer go through everything, and according to every official record that matters, this property isn't within any HOA boundary. You're either lying or running some kind of racket. She reached into a slim briefcase she carried and pulled out a set of papers, waving them in my direction. These are court filings, she said. You'll be served soon enough. We're prepared to see this through, no matter how uncooperative you choose to be. I glanced at the men behind her. Their fists clenched, and although they hadn't drawn their weapons, the threat was obvious. I wasn't outnumbered by just a small margin. I was outnumbered by heavily built guys who seemed ready to pounce if Sarah gave the word. That's so, I said, squaring my shoulders. Well, while you're busy forging papers and spouting nonsense, don't forget that trespassing is illegal in this county. Last I checked, I'm fully within my rights to defend my property. So unless you have a legitimate court order signed by a judge, get the hell out. One of the men smirked, then took a deliberate step forward. Without hesitation, I fired a warning shot into the dirt. It was loud enough to echo through the mountains, sending a flock of birds screeching into the air. The buckshot kicked up a spray of earth just inches from Sarah's expensive shoes. I kept the shotgun lowered after that, but the message was clear. You're on my land, and I won't let you push me around. In that moment, everything stopped. Sarah's men froze, probably reevaluating whether they wanted to escalate a firefight with someone who clearly knew how to handle a weapon and had the home field advantage. Sarah's face drained of color, but she maintained her composure impressively well. You'll regret this, she spat, her voice unsteady for the first time. We have the law on our side. I almost laughed at the irony. Funny you should say that. You can explain to the sheriff why you drove onto my property with armed men. I'm sure that'll go over well. Realizing they'd lost the immediate power play, Sarah jerked her head toward the SUVs. The men followed her, still glaring daggers at me as they moved. In a swirl of dust and exhaust, they reversed, turned around, and sped away, leaving me in a deafening silence broken only by my own pulse thudding in my ears. I stood there for a while, breath coming in short bursts, my shotgun still in my hands. Part of me was relieved they'd left without anyone getting hurt. Another part of me was furious. How dare they come onto my land, brandishing their presence like some kind of paramilitary force, all in the name of a bogus HOA. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about harassment. It was about intimidation, about making me think twice before resisting their claims. Once my adrenaline subsided, I went inside and called the sheriff's office again. I told the deputy on duty about what had happened. He said something along the lines of, well, if they come back, don't hesitate to call us. Try not to shoot anybody unless you absolutely have to. His tone suggested he knew I was within my rights, but also that he was tired of dealing with this escalating situation. I felt for him. Rural law enforcement can only do so much with limited staff and budget, especially against a group with enough money and influence to hire private muscle. Deep down, I knew the next step wouldn't be another direct confrontation. People like Sarah thrived on legal maneuvering, using lawsuits and court orders to drain you financially. The bigger the pile of paperwork, the more they believed they could bury you in it. They wanted to break me without firing another shot, and a protracted legal battle was probably their best bet. But they were about to find out that I wasn't the type to roll over or go bankrupt without a fight. True to her word, Sarah made sure I was served with a lawsuit the following week. A process server arrived, this time a seemingly unrelated individual, knocking on my door one afternoon. He handed me a thick packet of papers and apologized, looking genuinely uncomfortable about the whole thing. I'm just doing my job, he muttered before leaving. Couldn't blame him. I stood there on my porch, scanning through the lawsuit's opening pages. It alleged I was in violation of the HOA's rules, that I had built structures without proper approval, and that I owed back dues and fines that now totaled $50,000. My jaw dropped at the audacity. Even if an HOA existed, how could they possibly claim I owed so much in such a short span of time? It was ludicrous on its face. But I also knew that lawsuits are not always about winning fairly. They can be about outlasting your opponent in a war of attrition, forcing you to pay for legal defense, depositions, court fees, basically draining you until you either settle or lose by default. That was clearly the tactic here. Bury me in legal red tape until I couldn't afford to fight back. Then, presumably, I'd have no choice but to capitulate or lose my property through some shady legal maneuver. That's when I remembered Roy. He was a local attorney I'd met through a mutual acquaintance in town, someone who specialized in property disputes and had a reputation for being a bulldog in the courtroom. When I first moved to Idaho, Roy had helped me finalize the cabin's building permits and ensured that the property's title was clear. We got along well enough that he said, "If you ever run into any legal trouble, you know where to find me." At the time, I joked that the only trouble I expected was dealing with raccoons in my garbage. I called Roy immediately and scheduled a meeting at his office. Walking in, I felt a surge of relief just seeing his confident grin. He was a tall, wiry man in his 50s with hair that had long since gone white, but his eyes were sharp, giving him a look of perpetual readiness. When I slapped the lawsuit on his desk, he flipped through it briefly, then looked up at me, lips curled in a small smile. "Tell me this is a joke," I said, echoing the words I'd used when I first saw the papers. "Oh, it's not a joke," Roy said, "but it's definitely fake." He tapped a section of the lawsuit. They're citing sections of HOA bylaws that don't exist in any official county record, let alone a recognized homeowners association. And their claim that you owe them $50,000 is beyond outrageous. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I was holding. So how do we fight it? I can't afford a long, drawn-out court battle. Roy shrugged casually, the gesture of someone who's handled plenty of similar disputes. If we can prove their documents are falsified or that the HOA doesn't legally exist in the way they're claiming, we can get this thrown out. But I need to dig deeper. We'll have to check the county records, see if they really did file anything about expanding boundaries, and talk to county officials. Also, we need to find out who's backing Sarah. She's not doing this alone. I nodded, feeling a bit more at ease. I also have evidence of intimidation and trespassing, I added. Trail cam footage, a sheriff's report on the vandalism. Could that help? Absolutely, Roy said. It shows a pattern of harassment, which supports the argument that their legal actions are a bad faith attempt to strong-arm you. It might even open them up to counterclaims for harassment and emotional distress if we can tie it directly to them. We spent the next couple of hours dissecting every paragraph of the lawsuit. Roy circled phrases he found suspicious, scribbled notes in the margins, and fired off references to case law that I couldn't hope to follow. By the end of it, I had a glimmer of hope. If these documents were as fraudulent as they seemed, we had a strong shot at not only beating the lawsuit, but potentially turning the tables on Sarah. In the days and weeks that followed, Roy went into full investigative mode. He submitted requests for documents at the county clerk's office to see if any legitimate boundary changes had been filed for an HOA in my region. He also reached out to a few contacts he had in local real estate associations, asking them if they'd heard of any official HOA expansions. Everyone he spoke to either drew a blank or laughed at the idea. One friend of his jokingly said, "An HOA expansion that big would be front-page news in a small county like ours." Still, we needed tangible proof. Roy and I both knew that unscrupulous people can sometimes bribe or manipulate officials into filing bogus paperwork. If that happened, the fight could be more complicated. So Roy took a multi-pronged approach, investigating the authenticity of the signatures on these so-called HOA documents, confirming whether the board members even existed, and comparing the text of their bylaws to known, legitimate HOA documents in other communities. Meanwhile, I hunkered down on my property, vigilant as ever. I'd half expected more harassment from Sarah's goons, but for a time, things were oddly quiet. I figured they might be laying low, relying on their lawsuit to do the heavy lifting. Or maybe they realized that barging onto my property again might land them on the wrong side of a judge. In any case, the lull gave me a chance to gather my energy for the legal fight ahead. Roy scheduled a meeting to go over his findings. Sitting in his office, I sipped the burnt-tasting coffee he offered while he flipped through a thick folder. "So, He began, "I've got some news. First, the county clerk has no record of any legitimate boundary expansion. The only thing on file is a single piece of paper claiming to update certain property lines for an HOA, but it's missing official seals and dates. It's basically worthless in court if challenged." My spirits lifted. That's a start. What about the signatures on their board approval forms? Roy's grin widened. Several are forged. We cross-referenced them with official deeds and other documents. 2 of the signatures belong to people who are deceased. Another belongs to a person who currently lives in another state and has never heard of Sarah or this HOA. We're sitting on a treasure trove of fraud here. I let out a low whistle. So we've got them dead to rights? I'd say so, Roy replied. We still need to present this in court, but the evidence is strong. Once a judge sees how flimsy their claims are, they'll likely toss the lawsuit. Plus, we can file a countersuit for attorney fees and damages. The weight on my chest lessened. Finally, I felt like I could breathe. It's about time somebody exposes these people for what they are. Roy nodded. It gets better. I found out about a few other landowners in nearby counties who had run-ins with a suspiciously similar group. They either paid the dues quietly or sold off their land cheaply to avoid harassment. None of them stuck around to fight like you did. If we get them to testify, that's more ammunition for us. A surge of righteous anger coursed through me. So this is a racket. They find isolated properties, forge documents, and try to extort money. If that doesn't work, they escalate the intimidation until the owner gives in. Roy tapped his pen on the folder, a grim look replacing his earlier enthusiasm. Exactly. But your willingness to fight back could change the game for everyone they've targeted. We just need to make sure we have all our ducks in a row legally. I left Roy's office feeling buoyant. For the first time in weeks, I believed that justice might prevail. Sure, legal battles can be unpredictable, and even rock-solid cases can go sideways in a courtroom. But the sheer amount of evidence we'd gathered suggested that we weren't walking into a fair fight unarmed. Still, I was cautious. People like Sarah don't typically back down gracefully. If cornered, they might resort to more drastic measures, possibly even violence. But at least I now had a better sense of my enemy and a strong ally in Roy. Little did I know that the biggest showdown was still on the horizon, waiting to test every ounce of resolve I had. And while the legal revelations certainly gave me hope, they also raised the stakes. Because if Sarah and her associates knew we were close to exposing them, they might unleash one final, desperate attempt to keep control of their fraudulent operation. With the lawsuit in full swing, Roy and I ramped up our efforts to expose Sarah's organization for the sham it really was. Much of our plan hinged on the willingness of other victims, folks who'd experienced the same intimidation or had been forced to pay nonsense fees. It didn't take long for Roy to connect with about 15 people spread across the region who had stories eerily similar to mine. Some had been pressured into forking over thousands in back dues, while others had basically been chased off their properties. None had fought back legally until now. Roy believed that if we could show a pattern of extortion, forging documents, and harassment, we'd not only dismantle the fraudulent lawsuit but also open the door to criminal charges against Sarah and her cronies. The more we dug, the more evidence we uncovered. One homeowner had kept a record of threatening letters, all signed by a board member whose signature appeared identical to one on my so-called HOA expansions. Another had audio recordings of phone calls in which a man threatened to burn down his barn if he didn't pay voluntary dues. But perhaps the biggest breakthrough came when Roy discovered a paper trail of bribes. Through some of his contacts in real estate and local government, we learned of suspicious transactions, payments made to certain county officials who had the power to file or ignore property-related documents. It seemed Sarah's group had been greasing palms to keep any official scrutiny at bay. A few officials had quietly stepped down after pocketing these bribes, but others were still in place, presumably to facilitate more of these shady expansions. When I first set eyes on that evidence, I felt a wave of mixed emotions. Anger, betrayal, and a surprising sense of relief. Anger that people entrusted with upholding the law could be so easily bought, betrayal that the county offices, my first line of defense in verifying my property's independence, had cracks in their foundation, and relief because it meant we finally had something concrete, something that would show how deep the corruption went. Roy organized a meeting in a small conference room at a local community center. About a dozen of the other victims showed up. They shared their stories, some more harrowing than mine. One older woman had received daily harassment calls. Another man had found his livestock mutilated in ways that still gave him nightmares. Each account added another layer to the mountain of wrongdoing. "It's time we bring this to light," Roy announced to the group that evening. "We're filing motions in court to consolidate these cases. The idea is to show that this isn't just Liam's fight. There's a broader scheme affecting multiple landowners. Once a judge sees the scale of this, it's far less likely these con artists can wiggle out." One of the landowners, a man named Jeff, raised his hand. "I'm all for it, but I'm worried about retaliation. These people don't play nice. My family's safety is my top priority." Roy nodded sympathetically. "I understand. We can request protective orders. The sheriff's office is on alert. Though they're stretched thin, they do take this seriously. We can also push for a preliminary injunction to prevent the supposed HOA from taking any further actions while the case is pending." I chimed in. "I've been dealing with threats and vandalism for weeks. If we stand together, they can't pick us off one by one. That's exactly why they've been successful so far. Nobody ever banded together to expose them." It was a solemn meeting, but you could feel the undercurrent of hope. People who'd felt alone in their struggles now realized they weren't isolated cases. Together, we had numbers, evidence, and a growing sense of solidarity. Back at home, I reviewed the documents again and again, half expecting to discover some fatal flaw that would unravel our case. But each time, the evidence seemed more solid. Sarah's so-called boundary expansions were riddled with forgeries. The so-called community votes had never happened. Some of the signatures were from deceased individuals, others from people living out of state. And let's not forget the bribes, which were the biggest nail in the coffin. If you're forging community votes and paying off officials, you're in a whole different category of crime. We were talking about racketeering, conspiracy, charges that could land people in prison for a long time if convicted. And that's exactly where the focus shifted. With so many victims coming forward, Roy took the evidence to the district attorney. The DA, after initial skepticism, was swayed by the sheer volume of proof. Suddenly, Sarah's fraudulent HOA became more than just a civil case. It looked like the beginning of a criminal investigation. I caught wind of the shift in atmosphere when I started getting calls from an investigator with the DA's office. He asked specific questions, details about the vehicles, the timing of the visits, the names I'd heard them mention. He even took copies of the videos from my trail cameras. "We're building a case," he told me on the phone, "but keep your guard up. If these folks realize they're being cornered, they might lash out." That warning rang in my ears as I went about my daily chores. My property felt quieter than usual, which only added to the tension. Sometimes the most dangerous time is just before everything comes crashing down. I doubled my security checks, making sure the cameras were working, the fences were secure, and my shotgun was loaded. As it turned out, I wasn't the only one sensing an impending storm. Roy called me one afternoon, excitement tinged with caution in his voice. "The DA's office is planning a raid," he said. "They've identified a location that Sarah and her associates use as their base of operations. If they find what they're expecting, falsified documents, financial ledgers, maybe even evidence of bribes, this whole scam goes under." "When?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "Soon," Roy replied. "They don't give out exact details for obvious reasons, but it's happening. Make sure you're ready to proceed with the civil case once the criminal side starts unfolding." For the next few days, I was on pins and needles. I went through the motions of daily life, chopping wood, replenishing the generator fuel, cooking simple meals. But every time a vehicle rumbled up my driveway, I half expected it to be the authorities with an update or, worse yet, Sarah's goons coming to retaliate. Then, without any fanfare on my end, it happened. The DA's raid. I found out the next day when Roy called me, nearly giddy. "They got them," he said, voice shaking with excitement. "They raided an office where Sarah's group operated, seized computers, boxes of documents, and even found some of the bribe money stashed in a safe. From what I'm hearing, they have enough evidence to arrest several key players. My knees went weak as I stood on my porch, phone pressed to my ear. "What about Sarah?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "She wasn't there, but they've issued warrants for her and some of her top associates. It's only a matter of time before they turn themselves in or get picked up. This is huge, Liam. I think we just won the biggest battle." That evening, I finally felt like I could breathe again. I sat on my porch, soaking in the sunset, letting the tension drain from my body. I still kept my guard up, though. Desperate people do desperate things, and until Sarah was officially behind bars, I couldn't fully relax. But it was a turning point, one I'd fought so hard to reach. With the fraud exposed and the DA involved, it felt like the tide had turned. All those nights of worry, the vandalism, the harassment, it was finally leading to a tangible outcome. And while I knew the legal process might drag on, I at least had faith that the wheels of justice were now in motion. Sometimes, the darkest moments lead you to discover what you're truly made of. I'd learned that in my years as a marine engineer, facing storms at sea that threatened to tear a ship apart. You either bend and break, or you find the steel inside you that keeps you upright. Now, on this Idaho mountaintop, I discovered my own sense of grit and realized that freedom isn't just about isolation. It's about standing firm when someone tries to rip that freedom away. A few weeks later, the official trial for my case finally arrived. It wasn't just my suit anymore. Many of the other landowners had consolidated their complaints into one giant legal proceeding against Sarah's fraudulent HOA. But the judge had scheduled my hearing to kick things off, probably because my case had the most direct evidence, from the intimidation to the forged documents we'd discovered. I arrived at the county courthouse on a chilly morning, dressed in simple jeans and a button-up shirt. The old me, fresh out of the corporate marine engineering world, would have worn a suit, but living in Idaho's backcountry had changed my perspective on appearances. Roy met me in the lobby, dressed in his typical lawyerly attire, looking every bit the bulldog attorney I needed him to be. We stepped into the courtroom, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw Sarah seated at the defendant's table. Gone was the polished confidence she'd displayed on my porch. Though she wore a professional outfit, her hair was slightly disheveled, and there were faint lines of worry under her eyes. Her attorney, a slick-looking figure in a tailored suit, sat beside her, shuffling through papers. Sarah caught sight of me, and for a fleeting moment, our eyes locked. Her gaze was a mixture of anger and something else, maybe fear. The proceedings began with the judge reading the charges. Fraud, forgery, violation of property rights, and more. This was a civil trial, separate from the criminal charges still pending. But the allegations were similar enough to cast a wide net of suspicion around Sarah's entire operation. Roy opened with a calm but compelling statement about how I'd come to own my property, how I'd been harassed by a fake HOA, and how we intended to prove beyond a doubt that everything about their claim was a sham. Sarah's attorney tried to paint a different picture, that I was an unruly homeowner refusing to comply with legitimate HOA rules, and that the expansion of the HOA's boundaries had been lawfully approved. He produced a thick stack of documents, presumably the same ones they tried to serve me with before. But then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Roy started dismantling their evidence piece by piece. He called an expert witness, a forensic document analyst, who testified that multiple signatures on the HOA's expansion forms were forged. Next, he presented depositions from the county clerk's office, where officials stated no legitimate boundary expansion had ever been approved or recorded. Finally, he introduced the testimonies of other landowners who'd experienced the same harassment, tying it all together into a cohesive narrative of fraud and intimidation. The coup de grace came when Roy revealed the evidence of bribes, testimony from one of the county officials who had come clean in exchange for leniency. That official detailed how Sarah's group offered cash in unmarked envelopes in return for looking the other way when forging property records. The entire courtroom seemed to tense as the official described the hush-hush meetings in parking lots and restaurants, all aimed at legitimizing something that was never legitimate to begin with. Sarah's attorney tried to object, calling the testimony irrelevant or hearsay, but the judge allowed it, citing its direct relevance to the authenticity of the HOA's claims. For the first time, I saw Sarah's composure crack. She shifted in her seat, chewed on her lip, and stared straight ahead, as if trying to mentally will herself out of the room. By the end of the first day of the trial, it was clear their defense was on shaky ground. When the proceedings resumed the next day, Roy wrapped up our case by presenting the camera footage of trespassers, along with sheriff's reports documenting vandalism and threats. Although we couldn't prove that Sarah had personally ordered the trespass or the threats, the overall pattern was undeniable. It painted a portrait of an organization willing to resort to any means necessary to enforce their fake authority. Sarah's attorney tried to mount a defense, but it felt half-hearted. He questioned some technicalities, like the exact nature of the bribes and whether the official's testimony could be trusted. But the more he struggled, the more obvious it became that the evidence was too overwhelming to spin. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings, asked several pointed questions that further unraveled the defense's claims. At one point, she glanced at Sarah and asked, "Why would you need to forge signatures if this was a legitimate HOA expansion?" Sarah's attorney fumbled for words, eventually conceding that errors might have been made. When closing arguments wrapped, I felt a rush of emotion, an odd mix of relief, triumph, and exhaustion. We'd done everything we could. Now it was in the judge's hands. She took a brief recess, then returned to deliver her ruling right there in the courtroom. In a clear, measured voice, she dismissed the case against me with prejudice, meaning Sarah's group couldn't refile on the same grounds. But she didn't stop there. She also recommended a formal investigation into the entire HOA, referencing the evidence of fraud and corruption. Her words were stern. These documents point to a widespread scheme to defraud landowners and manipulate county records. This court finds such actions reprehensible and will refer all pertinent evidence to the appropriate authorities. It felt like the weight of the world lifted off my shoulders. I caught Roy's eye and we exchanged a small nod victory. People in the gallery, mostly the other landowners who had come to watch, let out muffled cheers and sighed in relief. Sarah's attorney looked like he wanted to vanish into thin air, while Sarah stared ahead, her face a mask of shock. As the bailiff announced the end of the session, Sarah stood abruptly. She started to walk out of the courtroom, but a couple of law enforcement officers were waiting near the door. I watched as they led her away in handcuffs, presumably on the criminal charges that had finally caught up with her. She didn't even look back. The aftermath in the corridor outside the courtroom was a mixture of high fives, handshakes, and hugs among the victims who had felt powerless for so long. Roy was swarmed by a small crowd thanking him for his hard work. I stood off to the side, taking it all in, my emotions swirling. Months of stress, threats, and uncertainty had led to this moment. A moment where justice actually seemed to prevail. I didn't gloat. I wasn't jumping up and down or laughing at Sarah's downfall. If anything, I felt a somber satisfaction. The fight had been about more than just me or my cabin. It was about principle, that no matter how remote or unassuming a person might be, they shouldn't be trampled on by unscrupulous bullies looking for easy profit. Eventually, Roy found me in the crowd. He clapped a hand on my shoulder and said, "Congratulations. You just put the final nail in their coffin." "Thanks," I replied, my voice quieter than expected. "I just want to get back to my life." "And you will," Roy assured me. "After the dust settles, you can enjoy that cabin without looking over your shoulder." I gave a small smile. Here's hoping. In the weeks that followed the courtroom showdown, the wheels of justice continued to turn. News circulated that Sarah and several key members of her so-called HOA board were facing serious charges: fraud, racketeering, conspiracy, and a host of lesser offenses. It was a full-blown scandal. Local news outlets wrote articles about how a fake HOA had managed to swindle or intimidate multiple property owners. They also dug into the stories of county officials who had taken bribes. One by one, those officials resigned or were indicted, fueling the public outcry even more. For me, life slowly returned to something resembling normal. The first morning I woke up knowing the lawsuit was behind me. The sun seemed a little brighter. I allowed myself a sense of optimism I hadn't felt in months. My routine resumed. chopping wood, maintaining the cabin, enjoying the crisp mountain air. I even got back to tinkering with plans for a small workshop behind the cabin, a dream I'd put on hold when the harassment started. I kept in touch with Roy for updates. According to him, the DA's office was building an even more extensive case against Sarah's organization, and additional arrests were likely. I filed some final paperwork to officially clear my property title of any liens or claims that had been wrongfully filed by the fake HOA. With each form submitted and each stamp of approval from the county clerk, it felt like another layer of stress peeled away. The actual sentencing for Sarah came a few months later. She ended up getting 10 years, with a strong likelihood of serving most of that time given the severity of the charges. Some of her associates received similar sentences. Others took plea deals in exchange for testifying against her. The fraudulent HOA was dissolved, its assets seized, and the ill-gotten funds were slated to be returned to victims. I wouldn't hold my breath for any substantial payout, but it was gratifying to see the system at least try to make things right. One afternoon, a few weeks after the sentencing, I had a surreal encounter. I stopped at a gas station on the edge of town to fill up my truck. As I walked inside to pay, I recognized Sarah sitting on a bench just outside the station's shop. She wasn't in her fancy blazer and high heels this time. She wore a simple gray sweatsuit, her hair disheveled, her face pale. I paused, uncertain of how to react. She noticed me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "Guess you won." I studied her for a second, recalling the times she'd threatened me, the times she tried to crush me under bogus legal threats, the intimidation tactics that had tormented me for months. But I didn't feel anger. I just felt tired. "It was never about winning," I replied, voice calm. "It was about what's right." She said nothing, just looked away. I walked inside, paid for my gas, and left. As I drove off, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her still sitting there, a hollow shell of the arrogant woman who'd once believed she could claim my land as her own. A part of me felt pity, though I couldn't quite reconcile that with the anguish she'd caused. Maybe 10 years in prison would give her time to think about the choices that led her there. Back home, I parked my truck and stood on my porch, gazing out over the land that had once been at the center of a high-stakes battle for control. The pines whispered in the breeze, the sky stretched endlessly above, and the cabin's log walls glowed warm in the late afternoon sun. This place had tested me, forced me to confront my own fears, to stand up for my rights in ways I never thought I'd have to. I rested my rifle. These days I kept a rifle instead of a shotgun, against the porch railing and sank into a rocking chair. The months of turmoil had changed me, hardened me in some ways, but also deepened my appreciation for this remote paradise I'd chosen. In the distance, I could see a hawk circling above the treetops, scanning the valley for prey. Life went on, nature undisturbed by the dramas of human schemes. I closed my eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine and earth. Nobody could take that away from me. Nobody could claim it as part of some fraudulent scheme. I was here, and this land was mine, truly mine in every sense that mattered. That evening, I made a fire in the stone fireplace and watched the flames dance. The roar of the blaze matched the roar in my heart, a fierce gratitude for having come out the other side. I settled on the porch later, letting the last of the sunlight fade across the valley. The hills were bathed in gold and purple, a tapestry of colors that felt like a gift. I found myself smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in a long while. Some people might wonder why I didn't just move, why I put myself through all that stress when I could have found another place to live. But that's not the point. When you have something worth fighting for, be it your land, your home, your sense of self, you don't let bullies and fraudsters chase you away. You stand firm, come what may, because freedom isn't a gift someone hands you. It's a right you hold on to with your own two hands. I wish I could say that it all ended perfectly, that the world is free of scammers and corrupt officials. Reality is never that clean. But in my corner of Idaho, for now, justice had its moment. The phony HOA was dissolved. My land was safe. And every time I look out over those rugged mountains, I'm reminded that peace isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about having the resolve to face it and emerge stronger on the other side. I leaned back in my chair, watching the stars pop one by one into the night sky. This was home, the place I fought for, the place I'd protect again if I had to. Because out here in the stillness of the Idaho wilderness, I finally found what I'd always been missing. A quiet sense of belonging, built on the foundation of my own determination, my own choice to stand my ground when it mattered most. And that's the story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you